TJ Technologies is proud to sponsor today's Farm Basics. Micronutrients are essential for healthy and productive growth in lawns, gardens, and crops. Check us out at tjmicromix.com because it's the little things that make a big difference.
Well, here on Ag PhD, we like to talk a lot about weeds, and one of the most important things you need to know is what's the life cycle of a weed. So today we wanted to talk about the different life cycles that are possible when it comes to weeds.
Well, weeds are no different than other plants. There are some that just live for 1 year. We call those annual plants. So they typically will sprout from a seed in the spring, and then they'll die off in the fall, either with the frost
Darren,
or...
Wait, we've got winter annuals too. There's such a thing as a summer annual, where it does emerge in the spring, and it usually dies off in the fall. But then you've also got the winter annual that could come up in the fall, actually live through the winter time, and then it's huge by the time spring rolls around, and then that might die off in the summertime.
Well, it's important to understand what type of annual weed it is, whether it's a winter annual or a spring annual, because that's going to determine when's the best time to get it under control and when you need to really get worried about that weed.
I thought the best time to get it under control is anytime you see it.
Well, you do have to understand things. Like with winter annuals, for example, early in the spring, they've already got a great big root.
Right.
They have a huge advantage over anything you're going to plant in the spring. So those weeds are really, really important to get after first in the spring. But when you think about weeds, not all weeds just have a 1-year life cycle. Some actually have a 2-year cycle, which is really kind of strange to me when year 1 is just about growing some root mass, gathering some sunlight energy, and getting all ready to do it next year. It sounds like my Minnesota Vikings, Brian. You know, maybe next year, maybe next year we'll get it.
But anyway, those 2-year plants, they're called biennials. And like Darren said, that first year is more about just producing the root, developing a good strong plant, and generally speaking, a lot of the biennials, in year 1, it will be what they call rosette year. They'll be in the rosette stage in year 1. Year 2, when they're going to go to seed, that's the bolt stage or the bolt year. And the plants look a lot different when they're in that first year versus in the second year. In the bolt stage, they'll get taller, they'll put the seeds on, and then they do try to go to seed at that point in most cases.
Well, you take a weed like musk thistle, for example, and it starts off with that rosette. And when you see those rosettes out in your pasture or grassland, you say, well, you know, that's a big weed, I want to get it under control. But when you see that bolt coming in, a great big head coming out with all those seeds, I know when we were kids, if Dad saw any of those in the pasture, it was, get out there right away, guys, we got to get that thing.
Well, see, that's the whole deal. The main thing with weeds is you want to make sure they're not going to seed. If they don't reproduce, then your problem is not going to get worse in the future. I mean, you can go out there and you can kill your weeds, but if a bunch of them have already gone to seed, well, guess what? You're probably going to have troubles for the next 5 or 10 years at least. Now, there is a type of plant that doesn't have to go to seed, yet it can still reproduce, and that's the perennial plant. How is it going to reproduce if it doesn't go to seed, Darren?
Well, perennial plants can reproduce a number of ways. They can make seeds just like the other weeds can. Probably the most common with perennial weeds is with rhizomes. They have root systems that don't just feed the one plant. The root systems actually move out and away from that plant and start new sprouts so that plant can keep growing, and actually the patch of perennial weeds just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading each year if left unchecked.
Well, the thing is, when you're after a perennial weed, it's way more difficult to control because of that huge root system. So for example, we like to use products that are systemic. Roundup, as an example, and you would use a high dose of Roundup, a concentrated shot of Roundup, in order to try to get into the plant and kill every single growing point all through that extensive root system that it's got. That's the only way you're going to permanently eliminate that weed. A lot of times what happens is people will use burner products like 2,4-D, for example, where it'll burn that Canadian thistle to the ground, but it won't kill that great big root system, and all of a sudden the root system will put up a bunch of shoots, and now it looks like you have 8 plants instead of 1.
Well, the other thing that people will do is try and use tillage.
Yep.
If you chop up all those root systems when a plant has rhizomes, you may have just made your problem worse.
Yep.
Now, instead of having one big plant, you've got a whole bunch of little plants out there that are going to start growing big themselves. By chopping up that root system, now your herbicide can't move down through the root system and kill weeds. And if a sprout isn't quite out of the ground yet, but it has a well-established rhizome system, your herbicide may not touch that weed at all. So it's a big deal with perennial weeds, if you're going to kill them with a systemic herbicide, not to do any tillage at all for probably at least a year leading up to when you're going to spray.
Well, one last thing when it comes to annuals, biennials, or perennials, remember that all weeds have only one job in life. It's not to make your life miserable. It's to reproduce. It's to go to seed or reproduce by rhizomes or however it's going to reproduce. And that's your goal as a farmer or just a landowner in general, is to stop the weeds from reproducing. That will lessen your problem in the long term.
Well, whether it's an annual, biennial, or perennial, you still need to get our weed of the week under control. Can you identify this week's weed?